The airport terminal buzzed with the low hum of travelers going about their routines, checking bags, shuffling through security, and glancing anxiously at departure screens. Among them was Naomi Carter, a poised, confident black woman, standing at Gate 27 with her boarding pass in hand. She'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, but as she glanced around, she couldn't shake the strange tension that hung in the air. Naomi wasn't new to flying. In fact, she traveled frequently for work, and she earned her priority status through long hours, tight deadlines, and countless flights. Today should have been no different. But the moment she approached the boarding line marked asterisk priority passengers, only asterisk, she noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The gate agent, Patricia, gave her a once-over that lingered just a moment too long. It wasn't overt, nothing that could be called out directly, but Naomi had seen it before. It was that flicker of doubt, the unspoken question. Asterisk, do you really belong here? Asterisk. Ma'am, this line is for priority boarding, Patricia said with a polite but icy tone. I know, Naomi replied calmly, holding out her boarding pass. Patricia hesitated, her eyes scanning the ticket like she was searching for a flaw, something to disqualify Naomi. The seconds stretched, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Behind Naomi, the line of passengers began to grow, and she could feel their eyes on her. Are you sure this is your seat? Patricia finally asked, lowering her voice, but not her suspicion. Naomi blinked, caught off guard. She'd been questioned before, on her credentials, her expertise, even her presence in certain spaces, but this felt different. It wasn't just about her ticket, it was about her. Yes, Naomi said firmly, her voice steady, but her patience wearing thin. Patricia sighed, clearly unimpressed, and motioned for Naomi to step aside. The murmurs from the other passengers grew louder, and Naomi felt the weight of their judgments pressing down on her. Asterisk why? Is she making this a big deal? Asterisk, she imagined them thinking. Asterisk why can't she just cooperate? Asterisk. Naomi knew better than to let it slide. She wasn't about to shrink or apologize for occupying a space she'd rightfully earned. But just as she was about to demand to speak to his supervisor, a tall, sharply dressed man stepped forward. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. Is there a problem here? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Patricia's demeanor shifted instantly. She straightened, suddenly nervous, and fumbled to respond. Oh, Mr. Hayes, I didn't realize you were. I'm asking if there's a problem, he interrupted, his gaze steady and unyielding. Naomi turned to look at him, surprised to see Daniel Hayes, the CEO of the airline, standing in front of her. She'd seen his face in the news and on promotional materials, but she never expected to meet him, let alone under these circumstances. Patricia stammered, trying to explain herself, but Daniel raised a hand, silencing her. Miss Carter, he said, addressing Naomi directly, please go ahead and board. I'll handle this. The tension in the air was palpable as Naomi walked past Patricia, her head held high. But the story was far from over. Daniel Hayes had only just begun to uncover the deeper issues at play, and what happened next would change the lives of everyone involved. As Naomi settled into her seat, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of ripple effect this moment would have. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Daniel Hayes wasn't just handling the situation. He was about to make a decision that would send shockwaves through his entire company. But that part of the story? You'll have to stick around to find out. As Naomi settled into her seat in the business class cabin, she tried to steady her breathing. The interaction at the gate had left her unsettled, but she was determined not to let it ruin her journey. She glanced around at the other passengers, most of whom were already absorbed in their own worlds, adjusting their seats, flipping through magazines, or scrolling on their phones. None of them seemed to notice the tension she'd just experienced, and that was fine with her. She preferred it that way, but she couldn't shake the lingering feeling of being watched. Patricia's scrutinizing eyes were burned into her memory, and Naomi found herself replaying the moment over and over in her mind. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated or singled out, and sadly, she doubted it would be the last. Still, something about this incident felt heavier, like it wasn't over yet. She pulled out her phone and opened a new email draft, jotting down a few notes about what had happened. It was a habit she developed after years of facing microaggressions in professional settings. Document everything. She wasn't sure if she'd need it later, but it gave her a sense of control, however small. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Daniel Hayes stood face to face with Patricia, his expression unreadable. The CEO had built a reputation as a fair and hands-on leader, but he was also known for his zero-tolerance policy on discrimination or poor customer service. "Let's talk in private," he said, gesturing toward a nearby office. Patricia hesitated, her face pale. "Of course, sir," she murmured, following him. Inside the office, Daniel closed the door and turned to her. "What exactly happened back there?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Patricia fidgeted with the edge of her blazer, avoiding his gaze. I just wanted to verify her ticket. It's standard procedure for priority boarding." "Standard procedure?" Daniel repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I've reviewed our policies extensively, and I don't recall any that involve questioning a passenger who has presented a valid ticket." Patricia opened her mouth to respond but quickly shut it again. She knew there was no easy way to explain what she'd done. "Let me be clear," Daniel continued, his voice sharper now. "This company does not tolerate bias, intentional or otherwise. Every passenger deserves respect, and it's your responsibility to provide that. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Patricia mumbled, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Daniel studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "We'll discuss this further after the flight. For now, I want you to reflect on the impact of your actions, not just on the passenger, but on the company as a whole." Dismissed. Patricia left the office with her head down, and Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't the first time he'd had to address a situation like this, but it never got easier. He prided himself on fostering an inclusive culture within the airline, but moments like these reminded him how much work there was still to do. Back on the plane, Naomi's mind wandered as she stared out the window. The hum of the engines was soothing, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. But her peace was short-lived when she noticed the man seated across the aisle sneaking glances at her. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. He quickly looked away, pretending to adjust his tray table, but Naomi could feel the awkwardness radiating off him. She'd seen this before too, the silent curiosity, the questions people were too afraid or too embarrassed to ask out loud. Naomi sighed quietly and pulled out a book, hoping to signal that she wasn't in the mood for small talk. Still, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Daniel Hayes walked through the cabin, his presence commanding but not overbearing. Passengers straightened up in their seats, some whispering to each other as they recognized him. Naomi glanced up as he approached her row, and their eyes met for a brief moment. "Miss Carter," he said with a nod, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. That's not how we do things here." Naomi was surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She'd expected a canned apology, something generic and obligatory, but this felt different. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "I appreciate that." Daniel hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded again and continued down the aisle. Naomi watched him go, her curiosity piqued. She wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but she had to admit he seemed genuine. As the plane took off and the city disappeared below them, Naomi couldn't help but wonder how this experience would play out. She had no idea that the ripple effects of this moment were already in motion, setting off a chain of events that would soon make headlines. In the hours that followed, Daniel Hayes began an internal investigation, reviewing security footage and interviewing staff to piece together exactly what had happened at the gate. What he uncovered was more than just a single incident. It was a pattern, a culture of quiet biases that had gone unchecked for too long. For Naomi, the flight was uneventful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. She didn't know it yet, but her name was already being discussed in meetings and emails back at the airline's headquarters. And as the plane touched down at her destination, Naomi had no idea that her story was about to become the catalyst for a much larger conversation, one that would challenge the very foundation of how the airline operated. What happened next would change not only Naomi's life, but also the lives of countless others who had experienced similar injustices. But for now, the questions remained unanswered, the tensions unresolved. And Naomi? She was just trying to get on with her trip, unaware that she was at the center of a story that was far from over. As Naomi stepped off the plane, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The crisp air of the terminal hit her, a welcome contrast to the stuffy cabin atmosphere. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her mind still replaying the events of the day. She tried to shake it off. After all, she was here for work, and she couldn't afford to let anything distract her. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Unbeknownst to Naomi, her name was already circulating among the airline staff. Daniel Hayes had made sure of that. As soon as the plane landed, he made a call to the airline's ethics committee, requesting a full report on similar complaints lodged against Patricia or any other gate agents. What he found was troubling. Several complaints over the years, none formally resolved. Daniel sat in his office late that night, reviewing the files. His frustration grew with each page. This wasn't just about Patricia, it was a systemic issue. Somewhere along the way, the culture he had worked so hard to build had faltered. And now, it was up to him to fix it. Meanwhile, Naomi checked into her hotel, hoping for a quiet evening, but her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family who had somehow heard about the incident. One text stood out. Her best friend, Tasha, had sent a screenshot of a social media post. The post was from a fellow passenger who had witnessed the interaction at the gate. It described Naomi's calm demeanor and the gate agent's accusatory tone, urging people to speak out against discrimination. The comments were a mix of support and outrage, with many tagging the airline's account and demanding accountability. Naomi stared at her phone, unsure how to feel. She hadn't wanted to make a scene, and she certainly hadn't intended for the incident to go viral. But now, it seemed like the story was out of her hands. The next morning, Naomi received an email from the airline. It was from Daniel Hayes himself, inviting her to meet with him to discuss the incident. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to decline. She wasn't sure what good could come from reliving the experience. But another part of her knew this was an opportunity to be heard, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. When Naomi arrived at the airline's headquarters, she was greeted by a polite assistant who led her to a sleek conference room. Daniel was already there, standing by the window. He turned as she entered, his expression warm but serious. "Miss Carter," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate your time." Naomi shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip. "I'm here because I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said, her voice steady. Daniel nodded. "That's exactly why I wanted to meet with you. What happened at the gate was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring it's addressed. But I also want to understand your perspective, what we can do better, how we can rebuild trust." Naomi appreciated his candor, but she wasn't ready to let him off the hook. "It's not just about me," she said. "It's about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. How do I know this isn't just damage control?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't shy away from her question. "You don't," he admitted. "But I'm committed to making real changes. That starts with listening to people like you." As they talked, Naomi shared her experiences, not just with the airline, but in other areas of her life. She spoke about the subtle biases she faced every day, the exhaustion of constantly proving herself, the weight of being both visible and invisible at the same time. Daniel listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. By the end of the meeting, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was just the beginning, but at least it was a start. While Naomi and Daniel were having their conversation, another story was unfolding. Patricia, the gate agent, was sitting in a mandatory training session on unconscious bias. She was defensive at first, convinced she had been unfairly singled out. But as the facilitator spoke, Patricia began to see herself in the scenarios being described. She thought back to the moment at the gate, the assumptions she had made, the way she had treated Naomi. For the first time, she realized the harm she had caused, not just to Naomi, but to herself and her own sense of integrity. By the end of the day, Patricia knew she had a choice to make. She could cling to her defensiveness, or she could take responsibility for her actions and commit to doing better. The decision weighed heavily on her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face the consequences. Back in her hotel room, Naomi received another notification on her phone. This time, it was an email from a journalist requesting an interview. The story was gaining traction, and Naomi was torn. Part of her wanted to step back to protect her privacy and focus on her work, but another part of her knew this was bigger than her, and maybe sharing her story could help create change. As she sat there, weighing her options, Naomi realized something important. She had a voice, and she had a choice in how to use it. What she didn't know was that her decision would set off a chain reaction, leading to changes she could never have anticipated. For now, though, the questions remained. Would the airline follow through on its promises? Would Patricia take accountability for her actions? And would Naomi find the strength to keep fighting for what she believed in? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain: the story was far from over. Naomi found herself pacing her hotel room later that evening, her mind racing with the weight of everything that had transpired. She thought back to her meeting with Daniel Hayes. While his intentions seemed genuine, she couldn't shake the doubt creeping in. Words were easy, change was harder. And then there was the growing media attention, something she had neither asked for nor prepared herself to handle. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, breaking her train of thought. It was a notification from the airline's official account, a public statement acknowledging the incident and promising an internal investigation. The statement read well enough, but Naomi could see through it. It was vague, carefully worded to deflect blame while maintaining the airline's reputation. She felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't just about optics, it was about action, and action still felt far away. Meanwhile, Patricia sat in her small apartment, staring at the email she had received that afternoon. She had been summoned to a meeting with her manager and HR the next day. The words were curt and formal, but Patricia knew what they meant. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation. She replayed the events of that day in her mind, cringing at how she had handled the situation. At first, she had convinced herself that she was following protocol. But now, the reflection in her mirror seemed different. She could no longer ignore the truth. Her actions had been wrong, plain and simple. Patricia's thoughts spiraled further. What if she lost her job? What would her family think? Her friends? The fear of losing everything clashed with the guilt weighing her down. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but the question remained. What could she do now to make things right? Back at the hotel, Naomi finally decided to check social media again, despite her better judgment. The post from the fellow passenger had gone viral, with thousands of comments and shares. People were arguing in the threads, some condemning the airline, others trying to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding. Naomi's heart sank as she read the hateful comments, but she couldn't look away from the messages of support. Strangers from all over were standing up for her, for what was right. Then she noticed something unexpected. A woman claiming to be a former employee of the airline had joined the conversation. Her comments hinted at a deeper issue within the company, alleging that the culture of bias and microaggressions wasn't new. Naomi's pulse quickened as she read on, the pieces of a larger puzzle starting to form in her mind. The following day, Naomi received another message, this time from a well-known journalist. The journalist had picked up on the viral post and was digging into the story. She wanted to interview Naomi, not just about her experience, but about the systemic issues that seemed to plague the airline. Naomi hesitated. This was more attention than she had ever wanted. But as she thought about it, she realized she had an opportunity to shine a light on something bigger than herself. At the same time, Daniel Hayes was in his office, poring over reports from his team. The deeper they dug, the more troubling patterns they uncovered, patterns that couldn't be ignored. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from one of the board members. The board wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. The pressure was mounting, and Daniel knew the next steps he took would determine not only the airline's future, but his own reputation as a leader. Across town, Patricia arrived at the HR meeting with her nerves frayed. The room was stark, the air thick with unspoken tension. Her manager sat at the head of the table, flanked by two HR representatives. Patricia braced herself as they began to recount the incident, their tone measured but firm. When they asked for her side of the story, Patricia hesitated. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "I made a mistake," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I didn't handle the situation the way I should have. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply sorry for the hurt I caused." Her admission was met with silence, the kind that stretches uncomfortably long. Patricia's heart pounded as she awaited their response, unsure of what would come next. As these events unfolded, Naomi decided to respond to the journalist's request. She agreed to a phone interview, choosing her words carefully as she recounted her experience. She emphasized that this wasn't just about one person or one incident. It was about a pattern of behavior that needed to change. By the time the interview aired, the story had reached a tipping point. News outlets picked it up, amplifying the voices of others who had experienced similar treatment. The airline statement was no longer enough to placate the public, and pressure mounted for more transparency. The tension reached its peak when Daniel Hayes called an emergency meeting with his leadership team. He outlined a plan for immediate action, enhanced training for all staff, an external audit of company policies, and a direct apology to Naomi. But even as he laid out his vision, he knew the hardest part was yet to come, earning back the trust of the people they had failed. Naomi, on the other hand, found herself at a crossroads. The whirlwind of events had left her exhausted, but she couldn't ignore the momentum building around her. She had become the face of something much larger than herself, and with that came both responsibility and risk. As the pieces continued to move, one thing became clear: the story was building to a breaking point. The question wasn't just whether justice would be served. It was whether real change could emerge from the chaos. And for everyone involved, the stakes couldn't be higher. Just as it seemed the storm couldn't grow any more intense, an unexpected development sent shockwaves through the situation. Naomi's phone buzzed again late one evening, but this time, it wasn't from a journalist or a supporter online. It was a private message from an employee at the airline, a whistleblower. The message was brief, but carried a heavy weight. "I've seen what's happening," it read. "I think you need to know this isn't the first time. There are internal emails. If you're willing to dig deeper, I'll share what I can." Naomi stared at her phone, her heart racing. The words opened up an entirely new dimension to the story. It wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about a potential systemic problem that the airline may have been keeping under wraps. The idea both terrified and intrigued her. She responded cautiously, unsure of the person's intentions, but knowing she couldn't ignore the offer. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes was grappling with his own crisis. The board had demanded an emergency review of the company's practices, and the initial findings were damning. Reports of bias in promotions, complaints swept under the rug, and a lack of accountability painted a picture he couldn't ignore. As much as he wanted to believe the company he led was better than this, the evidence told a different story. Adding to the mounting tension, a leaked document surfaced online, drawing even more scrutiny. The document was an internal memo, written months earlier, advising staff to handle customer complaints discreetly to avoid negative publicity. Though not explicitly related to Naomi's case, the memo suggested a culture of suppression, where keeping the airline's image intact was prioritized over addressing real issues. The leak only fueled public outrage, and hashtags calling for a boycott of the airline began trending. Naomi's anonymous contact sent another message the next day, this time attaching a file. The file contained snippets of internal communication that referenced similar incidents, customers who had been mistreated or ignored when they raised concerns. It was a treasure trove of information, but also a heavy burden. Naomi hesitated. Sharing this would escalate things to a level she wasn't sure she was ready for. But withholding it felt like a betrayal of everyone who had suffered silently. As she deliberated, Patricia found herself spiraling deeper into self-reflection. The HR meeting hadn't ended with a definitive outcome, but Patricia knew her job was hanging by a thread. The weight of her actions bore down on her like never before. She thought about her own upbringing, the lessons her parents had tried to teach her about fairness and humility. Somewhere along the line, she had lost sight of those values. Now she was faced with a choice. She could remain silent and hope for the best, or she could come forward and admit her role in perpetuating the airline's toxic culture. The tension reached a fever pitch when Naomi's journalist contact reached out again, this time with a startling revelation. The journalist had received an anonymous tip that the CEO himself might have known about the issues long before Naomi's incident. The idea sent Naomi's mind spinning. If this were true, it wasn't just about low-level employees making mistakes. It was about systemic negligence at the highest levels. As all these pieces unfolded, the airline announced a press conference, promising transparency and decisive action. That event was scheduled for the next day, and the media frenzy was in full swing. Naomi, Patricia, and Daniel all prepared in their own ways, knowing the press conference could either begin to resolve the chaos or blow it up entirely. Naomi sat in her hotel room that night, staring out at the city lights. She felt the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The anonymous employees' messages, the journalists' revelations, the public's growing outcry. It all swirled in her mind. For a brief moment, she thought about walking away from it all, but deep down, she knew she couldn't. This was bigger than her, and she had a role to play. At the same time, Daniel paced his office, reviewing his planned remarks for the press conference. He had written and rewritten his speech, but nothing felt quite right. How could he possibly address the layers of harm that had come to light? And what would he say if the rumors about his own knowledge of the issues were brought up? As the clock ticked toward the press conference, Patricia made a decision of her own. She pulled out her phone and began typing a message. It was time, she thought, to face the truth, no matter the consequences. The message was addressed to Naomi. When Naomi saw the notification, she froze. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching as she read Patricia's words. "I owe you an apology," the message began. "But more than that, I owe you the truth. If you're willing to hear it, I'd like to meet before tomorrow's press conference." The request left Naomi with mixed emotions. Could she trust Patricia? And even if she could, what difference would it make now? But as she sat with the decision, a sense of clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about individuals anymore. It was about exposing the truth and demanding change, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The stage was set, and the stakes had never been higher. Each of them, Naomi, Patricia, and Daniel, was about to face a turning point that would shape not only the outcome of this story, but the future of the airline and everyone involved. The morning of the press conference dawned with an air of tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Naomi had barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of the past weeks and wondering how this day would unfold. She had agreed to meet Patricia in a quiet cafe near the event venue, unsure of what to expect. The idea of sitting across from the woman who had caused her so much pain felt surreal, but Naomi's resolve to uncover the truth outweighed her apprehension. Patricia arrived looking more vulnerable than Naomi had ever imagined. Her usual air of authority was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made her hands shake as she clutched her coffee cup. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Patricia broke the silence. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to tell you what I've done and why. It's the least I owe you." Naomi listened intently as Patricia confessed. She admitted to her role in escalating the situation on the flight, driven by a mix of personal frustration and a misguided sense of power. But what shocked Naomi most wasn't Patricia's actions on the plane. It was what came next. Patricia revealed that after the incident, she had been instructed by a superior to downplay the matter and shift the narrative. "They told me to frame it as a misunderstanding," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to push back. And when the public backlash started, I was told to keep quiet and let you take the brunt of it." The words hit Naomi like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just Patricia's personal failings at play. It was a calculated effort by the airline to protect its image, no matter the cost. Patricia handed Naomi a printed email chain as proof, her hands trembling as she slid it across the table. Naomi's eyes scanned the pages, her disbelief growing with every line. As the two women parted ways, Naomi felt a mix of emotions. Patricia's admission didn't erase the harm she had caused, but it added a new layer of complexity to the story. Naomi knew she had to include this revelation in her decision-making as she prepared for the press conference. By the time the event began, the venue was packed with journalists, employees, and curious onlookers. Daniel Hayes took the stage first, his expression solemn. He addressed the audience with a carefully crafted speech, promising transparency and a commitment to change. He outlined new initiatives for diversity training, an independent review of internal policies, and a hotline for employees and customers to report misconduct. But the atmosphere shifted when a journalist raised the question everyone had been waiting for. "Mr. Hayes, can you confirm whether you were aware of systemic issues within your company before this incident?" Daniel hesitated for a split second, but it was enough to send murmurs through the crowd. Then he took a deep breath and said, "Yes. I was aware of certain complaints and reports. I deeply regret that I didn't act sooner." The admission was met with gasps, and Naomi felt a wave of validation and anger all at once. She knew this moment would be pivotal, but she also sensed there was more to come. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone with steady determination. She shared her story, recounting the events with a calm yet powerful voice. She also revealed the whistleblower's messages and Patricia's confession, holding up the printed emails as evidence. But just as the audience thought they had heard it all, Naomi dropped the final twist. "Last night, I received a call from someone unexpected," she said, her voice firm. "The whistleblower who provided me with these emails has come forward with even more information. What you're seeing here is only the tip of the iceberg." The room erupted in murmurs and flashes from cameras. Naomi looked out at the sea of faces, knowing she had just shifted the narrative once again. The airline wasn't just facing a PR crisis, it was on the verge of a full-blown investigation. In the days that followed, regulators announced an inquiry into the airline's practices, spurred by the new evidence Naomi had presented. Employees began to speak out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and systemic issues. The airline's reputation took a massive hit, but for Naomi, the fight was about more than one company. It was about creating a ripple effect that would challenge similar injustices across the industry. As for Patricia, she resigned from her position, choosing to use her voice to advocate for better training and accountability within corporate structures. Daniel Hayes, facing mounting pressure, announced his decision to step down as CEO, vowing to cooperate fully with the investigation. In the end, Naomi's journey wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity. It was about igniting a conversation that could lead to meaningful change. And though the scars of the experience would always remain, she knew she had turned her pain into power, inspiring countless others to stand up for what was right.